Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and begin. My name is Debbie Gould, and I'm the president for the League of Women Voters of Nashville. And on behalf of the League and Peabody and Vanderbilt University's Peabody College, I'd like to welcome you all here today. This is obviously something that matters to many, many people in our community. The League, in case you don't know the history, it actually began before women even had the right to vote in this country. And it's always been involved in efforts to create an informed and engaged citizenry, and also to be an advocate for responsive and responsible government. And both of those goals are being met here today by this event. Obviously, it's an opportunity for the public to learn more about this important issue in education today. And it also, from an internal perspective of our organization, gives us the opportunity to really model what we say, which is how to inform ourselves of an issue and reach a consensus and then engage in advocacy once we reach a position. So we're very anxious to hear what people from Vanderbilt University, who are researchers in leadership, policy, and organization, can tell us about this subject and give us some context so that we understand what will be happening in the state legislature during this session around this issue. We're going to begin by hearing from Dr. Claire Smrekar, who's the Associate Professor in the Department of Leadership, Policy, and Organization. And her research interests have really involved a lot of issues around school choice in a variety of settings. Two of her books, in particular, School Choice in Urban America, Magnet Schools and the Pursuit of Equity, and the Impact of School Choice and Community in the Interest of Families and Schools, clearly resonate on this topic. She is currently researching the influence of work structures, social networks, and neighborhoods on family, school, and community relationships, as well as desegregation, housing, and neighborhood capacity and school choice. And I'll let Claire begin, and then we will have questions at the end of all of our the presentations. I'll just let you go first.
Okay. Do I need a microphone for over here? Folks? Okay. All right. Thank you all for being here. It's my privilege and honor to talk with you this afternoon a little bit about my work on school choice. I'm going to kind of lay the groundwork for the two speakers that follow. My interest is in identifying the key policy values and the kinds of key questions that I think the public, policymakers, education leaders, and parents should be asking as the state considers this voucher proposal. So we'll start this whole presentation kind of broad brush with my set of slides. Now I see several of my students in the audience, and they know that I always begin a lecture with some cartoons. Just to remind ourselves why we love working in schools, why we appreciate studying education, and why some of us spend endless hours teaching and managing the school lives of kids. So kindergarten course is our start, and here's the start here. This little guy's not having such a good day, though. Go to kindergarten, finger paint, have quiet time, play with building blocks, eat lunch, listen to a story, take a nap, color, go home from kindergarten. Day after day, week after week, I'm 5 and I'm in a rut. Not a good day for the young fellow. Then, of course, we love the kind of history of American public education and how it stays with us in terms of organizing our school year and school calendar. So this cartoon captures that history. And the reason we have summer vacation is so you can go home and help with the crops. So just a lovely little reminder why we still have the agriculturally based calendar that we enjoy today, although many districts have moved away from it. And then, of course, a little bit of popular culture and a little bit of a return to one of my other favorite topics, which many of my students know, is the history of rock and roll. So I'm lousy at spelling because of my parents. They grew up listening to the Beatles, Monkees, and Birds. Okay. Now, I had other cartoons, but I felt in the interest of time I should get to the story. So, again, I want to nest the voucher proposal within the larger context of school choice and remind the general public that choice is complex and multivariate and includes charter schools, magnets, vouchers, closed open enrollment arrangements in school districts, homeschooling, and of course private schools. So I'm going to unpack each of these just a bit in laying out the landscape. So as you know, Tennessee has moved aggressively in the last 2 years to increase the number of charter schools. And when you think of charter schools, you want to think about autonomy and innovation. That's the whole idea around charter schools, is providing a degree of autonomy in exchange for increased accountability. Charter schools are one of the fastest growing sectors of school choice. It's now over 3% of all students are in charter schools, and charter schools comprise 5% of all public schools, growing rapidly. Charter schools are in 40 states and the District of Columbia. Magnet schools, where I've done some research on charter schools, primarily in Indiana, and magnet schools all over the country. Now, magnet schools, of course, were established 20 years before charters were. Magnet schools were established in the 1970s as a tool for desegregation. And the idea was to combine an innovative curriculum that would attract parents from across the school district, thereby creating diverse, racially diverse schools, with the expansion of parental choice, giving parents a choice to opt in to these magnet schools. So none of the kind of compulsory crosstown busing that characterized much of desegregation policy during the 70s and 80s. Magnet schools were conceived of this as an idea that would combine choice with innovation and desegregation, importantly. Magnet schools have kind of tapered off a bit. We enroll about 2.2 million children today in magnet schools, and they comprise 3% of all public schools. Now, vouchers, and this is where a lot of the interest and attention has been since 2011, when Wall Street Journal called 2011 the year of school choice, and in a commentary in July of 2011. And the Wall Street Journal picked up some 11 states, picked up the headline that 11 states were looking at vouchers. And those that already had small voucher programs were looking to expand them rapidly and aggressively. So today, right now as we sit, of course, Tennessee is considering a voucher proposal, but in 2011, 2 states expanded their voucher programs dramatically. Ohio and Ohio expanded theirs, Wisconsin expanded theirs, and Indiana developed the most sweeping voucher program in the country. So what I've summarized here are the big city programs in Milwaukee, Cleveland, and Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C.'s had quite a bit of trouble with theirs. And in the big states, Ohio, Indiana. Now I put Louisiana, but as you may know, about a month ago, a local district judge struck down their voucher program as unconstitutional, not based on religious issues, but based on equity and financial issues. Total voucher students about 105,000, which is 0.2% of the total enrollment. Okay. Open enrollment. This doesn't get much play or much press, but open enrollment arrangements allow students to move, or families to select schools outside of their zone. Sometimes open enrollment even spills out into an inter-district arrangement. Sometimes it's restricted by the need to make a case for enrolling in a school outside of your zone. Sometimes it's an issue of transportation. Often it's an issue of overcrowdedness and room in the school that a parent might want to move into. So it's not a big program, but it's an interesting option to explore, particularly, I'd say, inter-district open enrollment. And finally, homeschool, well, I have private schools after this, but homeschooling, which my colleague Joe Murphy just published a terrific book on homeschooling and capturing this expansion in homeschoolers, both in their numbers and in their networks, using high tech. So for 25 years or so, homeschooling's kind of been off the radar, but it's moving to the center of our attention because of a real strong uptick in the number of parents selecting homeschooling as their choice, and then networking with other parents in a incredibly expansive and I think innovative way. Typically the categories of homeschoolers fall into Christian fundamentalist families who find the curriculum in public schooling offensive to their deeply held religious values, and those I like to call the naturalists, those living off the grid, those who like to do things on their own and without any government intervention or involvement. We call them the naturalists. Okay, so I know, it's my term. Some people have other terms for it. And then finally, private schools. And what I think is fascinating about private schooling is it has remained steady at 10% of all school children for decades now. Decades and just 10%. You know, maybe 10.5%, but right in there around 10%. And as you see, almost half of all private schools are Catholic, or of enrollment, I should say. About half of private school enrollment is Catholic. But when we get to the voucher programs, by far, Catholic schools are the primary participants in the voucher programs in the big states like Ohio, Indiana, and in the city systems. Okay, now I love this pie chart. I got this out of a RAND published book from Ron Zimmer's colleagues. And this goes back about 15 years, so I'm going to update the numbers for you as I show you the pie chart. What's really interesting, it's based on household surveys. Choice in the present system. Okay, again, this is about a decade old, so I'm going to update some of the numbers. But first, I want to look at the residential choice, the left side of the pie, that kind of salmon color. What does that mean? What do you think that means, actually? That's right. I think I heard. That families pick their zone. They pick the zone. They live in the zone of the school that they've chosen, right? So they're picking their house and their school all at the same time, based on this, American tradition of zoning schools close to home, of assigning children to a school that's closest to home. So about a third of families we know actually look at the zones and look at the maps, and then they search for a house inside of that school zone. And that's really their kind of, if you think about it, as kind of an indirect school choice. Now to the far side, the purple, the other third of families who do not have the means, the resources, they choose to live where they can afford to live. That's what, it's an economic driven decision. And those families get the school that they get, okay, based on where they were able to afford to live. Now let's coming down over to the left again, private school, there's that 10% piece of the slice, the dark color. Homeschool and public school choice. Now homeschool, it says 2% there, so I'm going to bump that up, right? I haven't messed with this chart since I pulled it out of this book, this RAND published book. So I just like to leave it this way, and then I like to tell you that's up to about 3.5%. Public school choice, what do we imagine that includes? That includes that open enrollment and magnet schools primarily. Okay, that's what public school choice is. That's about 10%. That's all of the open enrollment or alternative schools or magnets. It's kind of an interesting label, actually, because obviously the next charter schools, which says 2% there, and that's now 3%. Okay, so that's charter schools they have sliced out, even though, of course, charter schools are public schools. But the 10% is really that other bundle. And I would think or imagine that the increase in charter and the increase in homeschooling is really coming from some of the residential choice and some of the non-choice families. A lot of charter school families, of course, are in high poverty areas in the cities. Okay. Why do we think about school choice? What arguments have provoked this discussion? What arguments frame these policy decisions around all array of school choice, primarily charters and vouchers? So let's go through each one. The first, I think, should be listed first, and that is this political argument, this notion of liberty and individual freedom. And the argument goes like this, that in a democracy, what is more important than the freedom to choose a school for your child? So many advocates of school choice and an array of school choice types of school choice will start with this political argument that it's related to the foundations of liberty in a democracy. But probably the most common, or I would say probably the most common argument, certainly heard across the media and in public debates, is the economic argument. And that one suggests that public schools are a monopoly and that the only way to move from mediocrity to excellence is to create market forces of competition. And that in a market, the high performers are rewarded with clients or consumers or business, and the mediocre ones are punished and are left to exit the market. So this is a free market argument that promotes excellence and punishes mediocrity. And that was really the argument set forth by Milton Friedman some 50 years ago, 60 years ago now, when he argued for vouchers. Milton Friedman, an economist. Third is a social justice argument, and this has also been used to promote or advance school vouchers. And the idea here is to provide an equal playing field, to give those families who do not have the material economic resources to select the neighborhood based on the school zone or to enroll in a private school, to give those families a voucher. So the social justice argument is one that is often accompanied by or used in conjunction with a voucher proposal. And in many other choice settings as well. And fourth is the pedagogical. Not heard much about this too much, but the pedagogical argument says it's kind of a psychological argument. That says, look, kids have different learning styles, different interests, and different tastes. And if we want to really capture their energy and their investment in learning, then you've got, let's make pedagogical frameworks different across schools. Let's make some schools STEM schools. Let's make some schools performing arts schools. Let's have thematic differences across schools and make those choices for parents. Just as we choose cars and we choose restaurants and we choose different items at a grocery store, make those kinds of school choices available based on pedagogical differences and diversity, matching students' interests. So those are the big, broad buckets: political, economic, a pedagogical diversity, and a social justice argument. But there are also these policy values, and these policy values are not just associated with school choice. They're associated with a lot of what we do in social policy, not just economic policy, but in transportation policy, in international relations, in economic policies. And they are the familiar four, and I know my students will, or you should, find these to be familiar. Okay, so excellence, efficiency, equity, and diversity. And of course, excellence really refers to this association between innovation and excellence, between alignment, between curriculum and the assessments that we use, that all in pursuit of a high-performing organization and a successful student. But I think it's kind of worth our time to unpack what we all might mean by excellence. Efficiency is also, I think, worth unpacking and distilling. So the idea is to maximize resources and capital assets, and it's more than curriculum and it's more than staffing. It also involves transportation and facilities. It also involves the kinds of decisions we make in the distribution of rewards and in sanctions. Equity, as I said earlier, is part of this argument around social justice, and it has often been associated, as I said, with vouchers, as well as with charter schools and with magnet school choices. And finally, diversity. And, in a moment ago, I spoke about diversity in terms of pedagogical or learning differences, but I'd like to bring the issue of racial desegregation and racial balance back into the rhetoric and into the mainframe here. I think diversity has to be part of this discussion. Whether or not you still think that it's worth fighting for, or you think that that battle's been fought, whether or not you still think it's worth looking at the socio-demographic distribution in a city and thinking about zoning kids or not, I think diversity needs to be on the table. Okay, so what we know about school choice. Now, this could be, of course, a whole 3-hour lecture, as my students will attest. So we're just going to go over this really briefly, and then my good colleague Ron Zimmer is going to pick up a lot of this. But I think these are the questions as voters, as engaged citizens, as policymakers, and as graduate students in training. This is what you want to think about, at least at this point. So who chooses in charter schools and in magnet schools and in voucher programs? And how does that fit with those policy values and those larger arguments? What do we know about the choice patterns of parents? We have plenty of data now. We can look at the voucher programs in these big city and big state systems. We can look at 4 decades of magnet school choosers and 2 decades of charter school choosers. And what we see is a consistent pattern. It's really lovely, actually. It's a consistent pattern. We pick this up in our interviews, and we pick this up in surveys. And we pick it up in rural and suburban areas that are connected to a choice system, and in the big cities in the Northeast and the Southeast. And the consistency is that parents choose based on quality, proximity, and safety. Now, what's interesting about that is when we say quality, I think I could get 25 different definitions of quality. Okay, so it goes from this sort of the parents, kind of like my sister, who looks at those test scores, and it's all about the test scores. And then my aunt, who might look at the feel of the school, walks in, does it feel like a friendly place? Then a cousin who might say, well, I kind of like to hear what my somebody down the street thinks about that school. So it's based on reputation of people they trust, and that goes to those softer skills, like is it a caring place? Do the teachers care about their kids? Do they respect parents? So quality can mean everything from trusting, respectful, nice, to test scores, and where kids go on to college. Quality has a number of different meanings and applications for parents. And often quality is associated actually with safety and the sense of place and space. And it's the place, is it a familiar place to families? Is it someplace close to home, close to childcare, or close to work? And that's why all three of those issues get connected and stitched together for many, actually for most parents. Let me go back to who chooses for a moment. Even within targeted voucher programs, targeting families that are lower income based on their eligibility for free and reduced lunch rate, tied to the federal poverty level, which I don't know if you know right now, for a family of four is $23,000. $23,000 for a family of four. That's the federal poverty threshold. What we find, even when these programs are targeted in that way, who's choosing or who's getting the voucher, it tends to be the top of that strata. Okay? It tends to be families with more education at the top of that income bracket. And that's why I think it's so important to look at social networks, how we package information, and how that information is targeted and disseminated. I'm going to just say the outcomes of all these, whether it's charters, magnets. I was just with the Magnet Schools of America. They like to tout, they like to say that their magnet schools are just outperforming all other schools, and they're not always outperforming other schools. So the mixed result has to be your headline. And then Ron will unpack that for you. Okay, so I want to end with these policy questions that are designed for public engagement, because if you've read any of my commentaries in the paper, it's about public engagement. It's about maintaining a civil discourse in education, policy, and other social policies. So that's why I'm glad to see this as overflowing audience today. So these are my questions. Is school choice school reform? If so, give me a definition of that and explain. We need to be able to answer choice. For what purpose? For what chance? Chance for what? Opportunity for what? I read a few days ago, Governor of New Orleans, Governor Jindal, said that he thinks private school is a chance and a choice that every child deserves. Private schooling is a choice, as a chance, every child deserves. That's what Governor Jindal said as he was bemoaning the judge's decision striking down the Louisiana voucher program. What is the test of equity, efficiency, diversity, and excellence in a choice program? I think there ought to be a test or a template against which we measure performance and the ability to meet those benchmark goals. And finally, what is missing in the choice debate? And that's where your voice is so important and your presence here is so valuable. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Claire. We're now going to hear from Dr. Ron Zimmer, who's another associate professor of public policy and education in the Department of Leadership, Policy, and Organization. And he's published over 25 reports, articles, and book chapters on school choice programs with a focus on school choice and school finance. And probably for this audience, the thing that we're most excited about is that you were involved with the task force that reported to the governor recently on school vouchers. I do have copies of the executive summary that are over on that little ledge over there if you are interested in it later, and also copies of the piece of legislation that the Governor Haslam has proposed, Senate Bill 196. So, Ron, I'll let you.
Well, thank you for inviting me here today. It's my pleasure to be here, and I appreciated Claire's presentation. I think it set a good foundation for my presentation. the good thing about this, people ask me to present this. Over the last couple of years, I've been asked a lot. And so it's an easy yes because I can just tweak this same presentation. I've been doing it over the last couple of years. So this is a question I've been asked, I don't know why, a lot recently, but I guess it's because there's lots of states considering what do we make of the voucher literature. So I'm going to narrowly focus on that. Claire gave you a foundation of various choice programs and so on. And so that's part of what I'm going to talk about, but I'm also going to talk about thinking about how you actually design the policy of a voucher program. And that is important. And a lot of what I'm going to present here comes from 3 different articles that I list there. So thinking about what are the goals for education, this largely overlaps with a lot of what Claire said previously. It's a bit of semantics of what I'm saying here relative to what she laid out. But these are 4 criteria that Hank Levin, who's been involved in the school choice debate since the 1960s, and he's now at Columbia University, and I really admire him. I think he's a great voice in this debate. He laid out, along with his colleague Clive Bevfield, these 4 criteria thinking about productive efficiency, that we want the most out of our schools for the least amount of cost. We want freedom of choice. We want to allow students and their families to match their needs to what's the offerings of schools so that they can get the best education possible. We want equity. Everyone has fair access to quality education. And social cohesion. This is the idea of the common school, that we integrate students into society. That may mean civic values and so on. It's a broad term for lots of different things. Now, these 4 goals have been embraced in different forms by those who advocate for vouchers. And it's made for strange bedfellows. You got these market choice people out there that really believe that the market is a way to get productive efficiency or freedom of choice. They think that's the solution to changing education to get significant impacts and changes to our current system. And then you have these other people that it's really about social justice, that there's these disadvantaged populations out there that don't have any choice except the school that they're assigned to. And we want to give them that choice to potentially attend a private school just like a more affluent family could. And sometimes these things come into conflict. So if you're trying to design a voucher program for the least amount of cost, one of the things you're not going to promote much is busing, because busing is expensive. Could you imagine all these different kids wanting to get to this central location across the city to this private school? You're going to have buses going every which way to get there, and that's very expensive. So those who are pushing for low cost would say no busing. But those who are pushing for equity would say, well, that's really going to limit who can actually take advantage of the private schools. And so those 2 things could come in conflict. And there's all kinds of these conflicts across these 4 goals. So you could also allow add-ons. So you have a $5,000 voucher. And that will allow you to go to any school that costs under $5,000 in terms of a private school. Well, you could allow families to add on to that and say, okay, you can pay the difference of going to this $10,000 private school. But again, that opens up freedom of choice or expands the number of options for families. But there's some families that are not going to be able to afford that. And so it restricts access to these high-quality schools. And there's a lot of tension. And what wins out in terms of policy is maybe who has a greater voice in those different decisions. And it's important, and basically, I'm going to go through these 4 criteria and what we know from the literature. I'm just going to briefly summarize this. So the thing that gets the most attention is productive efficiency. And this is thinking about student outcomes and at the lowest cost, and specifically we focus mostly on those student outcomes. If you hear a newspaper article about the DC voucher program or something else, that's generally what they focus on. And specifically, they focus primarily on the effects of the direct effects on students that get the voucher and go to a private school. There's also what's called indirect effects, and this is often called competitive effects. So students are using this voucher, they're leaving to go to a private school. The theory is that should promote the traditional public schools to improve. They want to maintain the students in their school, and so there should be some competitive effects. Well, in terms of asking what does the literature say about this, if I got 10 people in here that's done a fair amount of work in this area, you may get 10, not even slightly different answers, but pretty different answers among those 10 people. So for instance, these are quotes actually from Rick Hess's article. Jay Green said that it's unambiguous that vouchers have had positive effects. And then if you go to Cecilia Rouse, who's at Princeton, she said basically it's a trivial effect, if any, out there in terms of vouchers. And these are both people, good scholars, and they're giving you very different conclusions about it. So, and then also on the indirect effects, and this is just one example. So David Figlio, a very well-respected economist at Northwestern, did a study of Florida's voucher program, or their tax credit program, and looking at competitive effects, and he found a statistically significant effect. And those who are advocating for vouchers will say, aha, we found the statistically significant effect. However, if you read on in his own article, he said, yeah, we tried to get rid of this statistical significant effect in our article. We couldn't get rid of it, so it is robust, but it's really not meaningful. It's not a big effect. So depending who you ask, you get different interpretations from the exact same article. So why do we get these different responses? Well, part of it might be that you give different weighting to different articles. So, and some of that's legitimate. There's some articles that are not very well done and we shouldn't give great weight to, and some of them are well done and we should give stronger weight to. So some of it might be just different weighting of different articles. But I also think it's what the advocates have set up. They basically said that vouchers are going to just revolutionize education. They set a bar really high out there to say success is measured by this high bar. And anything that falls short of that is not success. So we could find positive effects out there, you know, that improves the education for students slightly, or maybe it's a better situation for it, but it's not that bar. And so we might say, well, okay, we didn't find that, so it's not successful. So a bit of the problem is those who are promoting vouchers have really sold it as something that could just completely change education that may not be reasonable. It's not to say that there aren't some effects out there. For instance, in the Washington, D.C. program, in one study that's a very good study by Patrick Wolf, he found a 21% advantage of graduating high schools for those who took the voucher. That's pretty substantial. I think something to pay attention to. However, there's many other studies that basically find no effects on different voucher programs, Milwaukee or Cleveland and so on. So we haven't always found consistent positive effects or consistent substantial effects, and certainly not effects that measure up to this high bar. And Rick Hess, who is actually a promoter of vouchers, he thinks that it could be a solution, has basically argued, well, it's just impractical to believe that vouchers are going to lead to this great success because it has to go through a political process. And to get the finished product of that voucher, you do a lot of compromising. And so, for instance, in Washington and Milwaukee, the voucher is only 50% of, according to Rick Hess, of the amount the school district gives per pupil for expenditures that attend a traditional public school. Well, that may be great for cost effectiveness, but it may make it very difficult to get positive effects from that type of program when they're spending substantially less. And it also may limit the choices you can make, what private schools you could go to. There's other things that were included in the Washington, D.C. For instance, when a student left a voucher or traditional public school for a private school, they didn't lose the associated revenue, so why would you expect any competitive effect if when the student leaves, you don't actually lose any revenue? In fact, they were actually given more money, and after the voucher program went in place, there were actually more students or more teachers place than when they started. So you had fewer students, more teachers. So it's hard to imagine you would have a competitive effect in that situation. And what Rick has ultimately concluded, it would seem that school choice works in some respects and in some instances, but the choice alone could never work as well as many of the champions have expected and promised. So if you want to believe what the advocates are saying, it's probably not going to live up to that. You may get some positive effects, and then you have to make the decision, is it worth all the political challenges of getting that? Okay? I'll go through these quickly because I want to make sure we get to Alan and also your questions. But goal 2, freedom of choice. Most of these things have been, research has shown that parents more satisfied that use the vouchers. I think that's a little bit suspect. If I just asked you right after you bought a car, did you get a good deal, you're probably going to tell me yes. If I ask a parent right after they made a choice of going to a private school, are you happy? You'd probably say yes because you want to justify the decision you made. So they've generally found positive effects on this. What to make of it, I'm not sure. Equity. Most of these, and Claire highlighted this, have been means tested, meaning that only people below a certain income level could be allowed to use the voucher. So generally, they have been used by low-income families. However, among that population, as Claire mentioned, it's mainly been higher educated families among that population that have used the vouchers. Social cohesion. Now, this one's kind of hard to define. So what do you mean by social cohesion? There's one interesting study, and you could say, well, maybe that we want a society that thinks about other people in society and is maybe altruistic or compassionate toward their fellow man or whatever. And there's this very interesting study by Eric Bettinger that they did in Toledo, which randomly assigned vouchers to students, and then other students just were in a control group, went to traditional public school. And they had to bring them in to take a test, and so they took the test and found no difference on those test scores. But also they said, well, while we have them in, let's do this little experiment. And they gave these gift cards to the students and said, okay, you can keep this gift card for yourself, or you can give it away to Make-A-Wish Foundation or other things. And they actually found the students that went to private schools gave more to these charities than those who did not. And what was more interesting is they did the same thing with the parents. They gave them $50, and there was no difference between the parents. So they were trying to tease out, was it really an effect from going to mostly Catholic schools? And there probably was a positive effect there. And so it's interesting. Is that what we mean by social cohesion? There's some other studies that found similar things. Well, you can make your own judgments. But I'll just summarize here. So there's been some positive results out there in research. Has it been to the level that the advocates have promised? Probably not. So what do we make of that? Well, I think you're going to have to judge whether that's sufficient, that we might get a positive effect from a voucher program. Is that sufficient to go through the political challenges of getting it? But I want to also emphasize that the design matters. Who you're going to get to participate in the program and who this might benefit is a function of the design, and so you have to spend a lot of time thinking about that in order to get a strong policy. So with that, I'll leave the rest of the discussion in terms of presentation to Alan. I'm interested in hearing from him from a district's perspective, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Alan Coverstone, our next speaker, is the Executive Director of the Office of Innovation for Metro Schools. And in that capacity, he oversees magnet schools and charter schools and is really looking at a lot of the options of choice. And so we thought it would be really interesting to hear a local perspective of how a large urban school district in Tennessee addresses some of the choice issues currently. And so I'll just turn it over to you, Alan.
Thank you, Debbie. Appreciated both of the presentations that came previously. I enjoy listening to researchers, and I've really had the pleasure of interacting less directly with Ron, more directly with Claire in the last 3 years as I've been studying here and have been immersed in this kind of research day by day. Now, Ron said the district's perspective. Debbie said a local perspective. I've been listening very closely to what perspective I exactly have. I think we need to clarify what perspective I represent. Otherwise, I will represent whatever you want it to be. And that usually doesn't go as well for me. So I will say this about my perspective. You will say what you will about my perspective, and many of you already have and frequently will again. It is unique. I think it has to be said that my perspective is unique. From my own personal educational history to my work history to my family history to the work that we do even in combining charter schools and magnet schools in the same office. That didn't happen a lot. To taking on turnaround schools and trying to cross-pollinate lessons from those other sectors, learning from private schools rather than holding them at arm's length, being the person at the party who says, you know, I'm going to make a school choice that's based on what's best for my family as I see it, and it's not self-defense, and I don't have to put down other schools in order to make that choice. So it's unique. It's not better, it's not worse, but it is definitely different, and it causes me